Hello, everyone, and welcome to Soft Stories. I'm Stratton, and this is Pepper, and today we are going to be continuing our reading of The Borrowers by Mary Norton. When last we left off, a terrible thing had happened to the Clock family. Pod, the father and patriarch of the family, had been seen by a child who was living in the house. In previous instances of borrowers having been seen, they needed to leave, lest the cat was brought in, and they meet a terrible fate. They have not yet decided whether they are going to emigrate, but one thing has been decided: that Arrietty, the young daughter of the family, will assist her father, Pod, in borrowing something that her mother says female borrowers do not do very often. Let's see what happens next. In Chapter 7 of The Borrowers. For the next 3 weeks, Arrietty was especially good. She helped her mother tidy the storerooms. She swept and watered the passages and trod them down. She sorted and graded the beads which they used as buttons into the screw tops of aspirin bottles. She cut old kid gloves into squares for Pod's shoemaking. She filed fishbone needles to a bee-sting sharpness. She hung up the washing to dry by the grating so that it blew in the soft air. And at last the day came, that dreadful, wonderful, never-to-be-forgotten day, when Homily, scrubbing the kitchen table, straightened her back and called, "Pod!" He came in from his workroom, last in hand. "Look at this brush!" cried Homily. It was a fibre brush with a plated fibre back. "Aye," said Pod, "worn down." "Gets me knuckles now," said Homily, "every time I scrub." Pod looked worried. Since he had been seen, they had stuck to kitchen borrowing, the bare essentials of fuel and food. There was an old mouse hole under the kitchen stove upstairs, which, at night, when the fire was out or very low, Pod could use as a chute to save carrying. Since the window curtain incident, they had pushed a matchbox chest of drawers below the mouse hole, and had stood a wooden stool on the chest of drawers. And Pod, with much help and shoving from Homily, had learned to squeeze up the chute instead of down. In this way, he need not venture into the great hall and passages. He could just nip out from under the vast black stone in the kitchen for a clove or a carrot or a tasty piece of ham. But it was not a satisfactory arrangement. Even when the fire was out, often there was hot ash and cinders under the stove, and once, As he emerged, a great brush came at him, wielded by Mrs. Driver, and he slithered back on top of Homily, singed, shaken, and coughing dust. Another time, for some reason, the fire had been in full blaze and Pod had arrived suddenly beneath a glowing inferno, dropping white-hot coals. But usually, at night, the fire was out, and Pod could pick his way through the cinders into the kitchen proper. "Mrs. Driver's out," Homily went on. "It's her day off. And she," they always spoke of Aunt Sophie as she, "is safe enough in bed." "It's not them that worries me," said Pod. "Why?" exclaimed Homily sharply. "The boy's not still here." "I don't know," said Pod. "There's always a risk," he added. "And there always will be," retorted Homily. "Like when you was in the coal cellar and the coal cart came." "But the other two," said Pod. "Mrs. Driver and her. I always know where they are, like." "As for that," exclaimed Homily, "a boy's even better. You can hear a boy a mile off. Well," she went on after a moment, "please yourself, but it's not like you to talk of risks." Pod sighed. "All right," he said, and turned away to fetch his borrowing bag. "Take the child," called Homily after him. Pod turned. "Now, Homily," he began in an alarmed voice. "Why not?" asked Homily sharply. "It's just the day. You aren't going no farther than the front door. If you're nervous, you can leave her by the clock, ready to nip underneath and down the hole. Let her just see, at any rate. Arrietty!" As Arrietty came running in, Pod tried again. "Now, listen, Homily," he protested. Homily ignored him. "Arrietty," she said brightly, "would you like to go along with your father and borrow me some brush fibre from the doormat in the hall?" Arrietty gave a little skip. "Oh," she cried, "could I?" "Well, take your apron off," said Homily, "and change your boots. You want light shoes for borrowing. Better wear the red kid." And then, as Arrietty spun away, Homily turned to Pod. "She'll be all right. You'll see." As she followed her father down the passage, Arrietty's heart began to beat faster. Now the moment had come at last. She found it almost too much to bear. She felt light and trembly and hollow with excitement. They had 3 borrowing bags between the two of them. "In case," Pod had explained, "we pick up something. A bad borrower loses many a chance for lack of an extra bag." And Pod laid these down to open the first gate, which was latched by a safety pin. It was a big pin, too strongly sprung for little hands to open, and Arrietty watched her father swing his whole weight on the bar, and his feet kick loose off the ground. In fact, I think there is a picture of this moment way back in the beginning of the book, in chapter 2. I didn't draw it to our attention earlier because of its incongruity with what was happening in the story, but there we can see Pod and Arrietty, and the gate, and the safety pin. Hanging from his hands, he shifted his weight along the pin towards the curved sheath, and as he moved, the pin sprang open, and he, in the same instant, jumped free. "You couldn't do that," he remarked, dusting his hands. "Too light. Nor could your mother. Come along now, quietly." There were other gates, all of which Pod left open. "Never shut the gate on the way out," he explained in a whisper. "You might need to get back, quick." And after a while, Arrietty saw a faint light at the end of the passage. She pulled her father's sleeve. "Is that it?" she whispered. Pod stood still. "Quietly now," he warned her. "Yes, that's it. The hole under the clock." As he said these words, Arrietty felt breathless, but outwardly she made no sign. "There are 3 steps up to it," Pod went on, "steep-like, so mind how you go. When you're under the clock, you just stay there. Don't let your mind wander, and keep your eyes on me. If all's clear, I'll give you the sign." The steps were high and a little uneven, but Arrietty took them more lightly than Pod. As she scrambled past jagged edges of the hole, she had a sudden blinding glimpse of molten gold. It was spring sunshine on the pale stones of the hall floor. Standing upright, she could no longer see this. She could only see the cave-like shadows in the great case above her, and the dim outline of the hanging weights. The hollow darkness around her vibrated with sound. It was a safe sound, solid and regular. And far above her head, she saw the movement of the pendulum. It gleamed a little in the half-light, remote and cautious in its rhythmic swinging. Arrietty felt warm tears behind her eyelids and a sudden swelling pride. So this, at last, was the clock. Their clock, after which the family was named. For 200 years it had stood there, deep-voiced and patient, guarding their threshold and measuring their time. But Pod, she saw, crouched beneath the carved archway against the light. "Keep your eyes on me," he had said, so Arrietty crouched too. She saw the gleaming golden stone floor of the hall stretching away into distance. She saw the edges of rugs like richly coloured islands in a molten sea. And she saw, in a glory of sunlight, like a dreamed-of gateway to fairyland, the open front door. And we too can see the scene. There, friends, is the clock for which our borrowers are named. A beautiful thing indeed, and a nice, safe haven. Beyond she saw grass, and against the clear, bright sky, a waving frond of green. Pod's eyes slewed round. "Wait," he breathed, "and watch." And then, in a flash, he was gone. Arrietty saw him scurry across the sunlit floor. Swiftly he ran, as a mouse runs, or a blown dry leaf. And suddenly she saw him as small. But she told herself, he isn't small. He's a half a head taller than Mother. She watched him run round a chestnut-coloured island of doormat into the shadows beside the door. There, it seemed, he became invisible. Arrietty watched and waited. All was still, except for a sudden whir within the clock. A grinding whir it was, up high in the hollow darkness above her head, then the sliding grate of slipped metal before the clock sang out its chime. 3 notes were struck, deliberate and mellow. Take it or leave it, they seemed to say, but that's the time. A sudden movement near the shadowed lintel of the front door, and there was Pod again, bag in hand beside the mat. It rose knee-deep before him, like a field of chestnut corn. Arrietty saw him glance towards the clock, and then she saw him raise his hand. Oh, the warmth of the stone flags as she ran across them, the gladdening sunlight on her face and hands, the awful space above and around her. Pod caught her and held her at last, and patted her shoulder. "There, there," he said. "Get your breath. Good girl." Panting a little, Arrietty gazed about her. She saw great chair legs rearing up into sunlight. She saw the shadowed undersides of their seats, spread above her like canopies. She saw the nails and the strapping and odd tags of silk and string. She saw the terraced cliffs of the stairs, mounting up into the distance, up and up. She saw carved table legs and a cavern under the chest. And all the time, in the stillness, the clock spoke, measuring out the seconds, spreading its layers of calm. And there is our 2 little borrowers running to the mat, and you can see Pod drawing the brush from the mat for his kind wife homily. And then, turning, Arrietty looked at the garden. She saw a gravelled path full of coloured stones, the size of walnuts they were, with here and there a blade of grass between them, transparent, green, against the light of the sun. Beyond the path she saw a grassy bank rising steeply to a tangled hedge, and beyond the hedge she saw fruit trees, bright with blossom. "Here's a bag," said Pod, in a hoarse whisper. "Better get down to work." Obediently, Arrietty started pulling fibre. Stiff it was, and full of dust. Pod worked swiftly and methodically, making small bundles, each of which he put immediately in the bag. "If you have to run suddenly," he explained, "you don't want to leave nothing behind." "It hurts your hands," said Arrietty, "doesn't it?" And suddenly she sneezed. "Not my hands, it doesn't," said Pod. "They're hardened like." And Arrietty sneezed again. "Dusty, isn't it?" she said. Pod straightened his back. "No good pulling where it's knotted right in," he said, watching her. "No wonder it hurts your hands. See here," he exclaimed after a moment. "You leave it. It's your first time up, like. You sit on the step there and take a peek out of doors." "Oh, no," Arrietty began. "If I don't help," she thought, "he won't want me again." But Pod insisted. I'm better on my own, he said. I can choose me bits, if you see what I mean, seeing as it's me who's got to make the brush. Chapter 8. The step was warm, but very steep. If I got down to the path, Arrietty thought, I might not get up again. So for some moments she sat, quietly. After a while she noticed the shoe scraper. Arrietty, Pod called, softly. Where have you got to? I just climbed down the shoe scraper, she called back. He came along and looked down at her from the top of the step. That's all right, he said after a moment's stare, but never climb down anything that isn't fixed like. Supposing one of them came along and moved the shoe scraper, where would you be then? How would you get up? It's heavy to move, said Arrietty. Maybe, said Pod, but it's movable. See what I mean? There's rules, my lass, and you got to learn. This path, Arrietty said, goes round the house. And the bank does too. Well, said Pod, what of it? And here we can see the two of them standing at the shoe scraper, a device which I have not often had occasion to use, but which is somehow indelibly marked in my memory as a thing outside these old houses. Arrietty rubbed one red kid shoe on a rounded stone. It's my grating, she said. I was thinking that my grating must be just round the corner. My grating looks out onto this bank. Your grating? Exclaimed Pod. Since when has it been your grating? I was thinking, Arrietty went on, suppose I went round the corner and just called through the grating to Mother. No, said Pod. We're not going to have none of that. Not going round corners. Then, went on Arrietty, she'd see I was all right like. Well, said Pod, and then he half smiled. Go quickly then, and call. I'll watch for you here. Not loud, mind. Arrietty ran. The stones in the path were firmly bedded, and her light, soft shoes hardly seemed to touch them. How glorious it was to run. You could never run under the floor. You walked, you stooped, you crawled, but you never ran. Arrietty nearly ran past the grating. She saw it just in time after she turned the corner. Yes, there it was, quite close to the ground, embedded deeply in the old wall of the house. There was the moss below it, in a spreading greenish stain. Arrietty ran up to it. Mother, she called, her nose against the iron grill. Mother! She waited quietly, and after a moment she called again. At the third call, Homily came. Her hair was coming down, and she carried, as though it were heavy, the screw lid of a pickle jar, filled with soapy water. Oh, she said in an annoyed voice, you didn't half give me a turn. What do you think you're up to? Where's your father? Arrietty jerked her head sideways. Just there, by the front door. She was so full of happiness that, out of Homily's sight, her toes danced on the green moss. Here she was, on the other side of the grating. Here she was, at last, outside, looking in. "Yes," said Homily, "they opened that door like that the first day of spring." "Well," she went on briskly, "you run back to your father and tell him if the morning room door happens to be open that I wouldn't say no to a bit of red blotting paper. Mind out of my way now while I throw the water." "Oh, that's what grows the moss," thought Arrietty as she sped back to her father. "All the water we empty through the grating." Pod looked relieved when he saw her, but frowned at the message. "How'll she expect me to climb that desk without me pin? Blotting paper's a curtain and chair job, and she should know it. Come on now, up with you." "Oh, let me stay down," pleaded Arrietty. "Just a bit longer. Just till you finish. They're all out, except her. Mother said so."
"She'd say anything," grumbled Pod, "when she wants something quick. How does she know she won't take it into her head to get out of that bed of hers and come downstairs with a stick? How does she know Mrs. Driver ain't stayed at home today with the headache? How does she know that boy ain't still here?"
"What boy?" asked Arrietty. Pod looked embarrassed.
"What boy?"
he repeated vaguely, and then went on. "Or maybe Crampfurl." "Crampfurl isn't a boy," said Arrietty.
"No, he isn't," said Pod. "Not in a manner of speaking, no,"
he went on, as though thinking this out.
"No, you wouldn't call Crampfurl a boy, not as you might say a boy exactly. Well," he said, beginning to move away, "stay down a bit, if you like, but stay close."
Arrietty watched him move away from the step, and then she looked about her. Oh, glory! Oh, joy! Oh, freedom! The sunlight, the grasses, the soft moving air, and halfway up the bank, where it curved round the corner, a flowering cherry tree. Below it, on the path, lay a stain of pinkish petals, and at the tree's foot, pale as butter, a nest of primroses. Arrietty threw a cautious glance towards the front doorstep, and then, light and dancey in her soft red shoes, she ran towards the petals. They were curved like shells and rocked as she touched them. She gathered several up and laid them, one inside the other, up and up like a card castle, and then she spilled them. Pod came again to the top of the step and looked along the path.
"Don't you go far,"
he said after a moment. Seeing his lips move, she smiled back at him. She was too far already to hear the words. A greenish beetle, shining in the sunlight, came towards her across the stones. She laid her fingers lightly on its shell, and it stood still, waiting and watchful, and when she moved her hand the beetle went swiftly on. An ant came, hurrying in a busy zigzag. She danced in front of it to tease it and put out her foot. It stared at her nonplussed, waving its antenna. Then, pettishly, as though put out, it swerved away. Two birds came down, quarrelling shrilly, into the grass below the tree. One flew away, but Arrietty could see the other among the moving grass stems above her on the slope. Cautiously, she moved towards the bank and climbed a little nervously in amongst the green blades. As she parted them gently with her bare hands, drops of water plopped on her skirt, and she felt the red shoes become damp. But on she went, pulling herself up now and again by rooty stems into this jungle of moss and wood violet and creeping leaves of clover. The sharp-seeming grass blades, waist high, were tender to the touch and sprang back lightly behind her as she passed. When at last she reached the foot of the tree, the bird took fright and flew away, and she sat down suddenly on a gnarled leaf of primrose. The air was filled with scent. But nothing will play with you, she thought, and saw the cracks and furrows of the primrose leaves held crystal beads of dew. If she pressed the leaf, these rolled like marbles. The bank was warm, almost too warm here within the shelter of the tall grass, and the sandy earth smelled dry. Standing up, she picked a primrose. The pink stalk felt tender and living in her hands, and was covered with silvery hairs, and when she held the flower, like a parasol, between her eyes and the sky, she saw the sun's pale light through the veined petals. On a piece of bark she found a woodlouse, and she struck it lightly with her swaying flower. It curled immediately and became a ball, bumping softly away downhill in amongst the grass roots. But she knew about woodlice. There were plenty of them at home, under the floor. Homily always scolded her if she played with them because, she said, they smelled like old knives. She lay back among the stalks of the primroses, and they made a coolness between her and the sun. And then, sighing, she turned her head and looked sideways up the bank among the grass stems. Startled, she caught her breath. Something had moved above her on the bank. Something had glittered. Arrietty stared. Chapter 9. It was an eye, or it looked like an eye, clear and bright like the colour of the sky. An eye like her own, but enormous. A glaring eye. Breathless with fear, she sat up, and the eye blinked. A great fringe of lashes came curving down and flew up again out of sight. Cautiously, Arrietty moved her legs. She would slide noiselessly in among the grass stems and slither away down the bank. "Don't move," said a voice, and the voice, like the eye, was enormous, but somehow hushed and hoarse, like a surge of wind through the grating on a stormy night in March. Arrietty froze. So this is it, she thought, the worst and most terrible thing of all. I've been seen. Whatever happened to Eglantine will now almost certainly happen to me. There was a pause, and Arrietty, her heart pounding in her ears, heard the breath again drawn swiftly into the vast lungs. "Or," said the voice, whispering still, "I shall hit you with my ash stick." Suddenly Arrietty became calm. "Why?" she asked. How strange her own voice sounded. Crystal thin and harebell clear, it tinkled on the air. "In case," came the surprised whisper at last, "you ran towards me, quickly, through the grass. In case," it went on, trembling a little, "you scrabbled at me with your nasty little hands." Arrietty stared at the eye. She held herself quite still. "Why?" she asked again, and again the word tinkled. Icy cold it sounded this time, and needle sharp. "Things do," said the voice. "I've seen them. In India." Arrietty thought of her gazetteer of the world. "You're not in India now," she pointed out. "Did you come out of the house?" "Yes." "From whereabouts in the house?" Arrietty stared at the eye. "I'm not going to tell you," she said at last, bravely. "Then I'll hit you with my ash stick." "All right," said Arrietty. "Hit me." "I'll pick you up and break you in half." Arrietty stood up. "All right," she said, and took 2 paces forward. There was a sharp gasp and an earthquake in the grass. He spun away from her and sat up, a great mountain in a green jersey. He had fair, straight hair and golden eyelashes. "Stay where you are," he cried. Arrietty stared up at him. So, this was the boy. Breathless, she felt, and light with fear. "I guessed you were about 9, she gasped after a moment. He flushed. "Well, you're wrong. I'm 10. He looked down at her, breathing deeply. "How old are you?" 14, said Arrietty. "Next June," she added, watching him. There was a silence while Arrietty waited, trembling a little. "Can you read?" the boy said at last. "Of course," said Arrietty. "Can't you?" "No," he stammered. Yes. I've just come from India." "What's that got to do with it?" asked Arrietty. "Oh," he said again, and picked up 2 petals of cherry blossom, which he folded together like a sandwich, and ate slowly. "Supposing," he said, staring past her at the wall of the house, "you saw a little man, about as tall as a pencil, with a blue patch in his trousers, halfway up a curtain window, carrying a doll's teacup. Would you say it was a fairy?" "No," said Arrietty. "I'd say it was my father." "Oh," said the boy, thinking this out. "Does your father have a blue patch on his trousers?" "Not on his best trousers. He does on his borrowing ones." "Oh," said the boy again. He seemed to find it a safe sound, as lawyers do. "Are there many people like you?" "No," said Arrietty. "None. We're all different." As small as you." Arrietty laughed. "Oh, don't be silly," she said. "Surely you don't think there are many people in the world your size?" "There are more my size than yours," he retorted. "Oh, honestly," began Arrietty helplessly, and laughed again. "Do you really think? Whatever sort of a world would it be? Those great chairs, I've seen them. Fancy if you had to make chairs that size for everyone. And the stuff for their clothes, miles and miles of it, tents of it. And the sewing. And their great houses reaching up so you could hardly see the ceilings. Their great beds, the food they eat. Great smoking mountains of it, huge bogs of stew and soup and stuff.
Don't you eat soup? Asked the boy.
Of course we do, laughed Arrietty. My father had an uncle who had a little boat which he rowed round in the stockpot, picking up flotsam and jetsam. He did bottom fishing too for bits of marrow until the cook got suspicious through finding bent pins in the soup. Once he was nearly shipwrecked on a chunk of submerged shin bone. He lost his oars and the boat sprang a leak, but he flung a line over the pot handle and pulled himself alongside the rim. But all that stock, fathoms of it, and the size of the stock pot. I mean, there wouldn't be enough stuff in the world to go round after a bit. And that's why my father says it's a good thing they're dying out. Just a few, my father says. That's all we need. To keep us. Otherwise, he says, the whole thing gets...
Arrietty hesitated, trying to remember the word.
Exaggerated, he says.
What do you mean? Asked the boy. To keep us.
And that, friends, is where we will end for today. Exciting stuff, the interaction between the boy and Arrietty. I am intrigued by this worldview of the borrowers, the way they believe that everything would just be too much if it were all made for humans. That sense of scale and perspective really makes you think about our own consumption and about the worldviews of those around us, doesn't it? If the borrowers can see our world as just too big for its own good, what does that mean for the things that we see in our world? Thank you so much for joining us this time on Soft Stories. But before I say goodbye, there is one thing I wanted to mention. My lovely girlfriend is a great fan of the First We Feast series, Hot Ones, which is a really interesting interview show where the guests and the host are subjected to increasingly spicy sauces on hot wings. She thought it would be a fun idea for us to try such a thing, and for it to go up on this very channel. I agreed, and I think that it would be an excellent thing to see. I don't know how it's going to go, but I would love to solicit some questions for that interview from you, our viewership. I really appreciate you being involved with the channel and the comments that these videos receive. So if you have any questions for me about the series, about myself, about our new co-host Pepper, or anything else in life that you would like to hear me talk about, please comment below and I would be delighted to include them in that interview show. I don't know how it's going to go. I have seen quite a few of the Hot Ones episodes and people seem to fall apart. I don't know if I'll be able to maintain the subdued and calm environment which I try so hard to keep up on this series, but I think it's worth a go, and I think that it will be an entertaining time for me and hopefully fun to watch for you too. I look forward to seeing your questions. I'll solicit them in the next episode of Emma as well, and it will be a few weeks before that episode is up, the Hot Ones challenge, as it were, but I look forward to it. I hope that you will as well. Until next time, and until that time, I wish you all the best, and goodbye.